Good morning, thanks for meeting me, Alan.
You're welcome. I went to war on November 9, 1942, crossing into neutral Switzerland from Vichy, France, just minutes before the Nazis closed the border. I usually tell the story of my border crossing with pulse-racing, dramatic flair. But, in reality, it went surprisingly smoothly, especially considering that I was a 49-year-old Wall Street lawyer with a high international profile. After presenting my passport to the French gendarme at the border station near Geneva, I paced the train platform while the policeman made a phone call to Vichy authorities. Then, after a hovering Gestapo agent conveniently disappeared, the gendarme obligingly waved me through. It was almost as if I was expected. There was nothing undercover about my wartime exploits in Switzerland. Afterward, I made much of my espionage adventures, with a sympathetic press and then equally credulous biographers dutifully repeating my beguiling tales. But, in truth, there was little daring involved, for a very simple reason. I was more in step with many Nazi leaders than I was with President Roosevelt. I not only enjoyed a professional and social familiarity with many members of the Third Reich's elite that predated the war, I shared many of these men's post-war goals. It was almost as if I was expected. Encircled by Nazi forces, but also surrounded by old friends. After crossing the border, I wasted no time in settling into Bern, the scenic Swiss capital where I had begun my espionage career a quarter-century earlier as a junior member of the U.S. legation during World War I. The medieval city, built on cliffs overlooking the glacial Greener River, as it flowed down from the white-capped alpine peaks on the horizon, held a treasure of memories. During the earlier war, there had been embassy parties and rounds of tennis, with balls arriving in diplomatic pouches from back home, courtesy of my brother Foster. There was an international parade of mistresses, young secretaries from the consulates that filled the city's diplomatic quarter, as well as free-spirited women from the local art colony. I met my conquests for drinks and pleasure at the Bellevue Palace Hotel, the elegant Art Nouveau fortress that dominated the old city's skyline. I affected the look of a dashing Continental cavalry officer in those days, with a waxed mustache, slim waist jacket, and high-starched collar. One of my affairs during the First World War had a brutal ending. She was a young Czech patriot who worked alongside me in the U.S. legation offices. British agents concluded that she was using her position to pass information to exiled Czech leader Jan Masaryk as well as to the Germans. When the British confronted me with their suspicions, as an ambitious young diplomat, I knew I was in an awkward spot, and I quickly complied with their plans. One night I took the woman to dinner, and afterward strolled with her along the cobblestone streets to an agreed-upon location, where I handed her over to 2 British agents. She disappeared forever. When I returned to Bern in 1942 for the Office of Strategic Services (OSS), this was America's World War II spy agency, I set up my base of operations in my residence, the ground floor apartment of a handsomely renovated 14th century mansion at 23 Haranguesi, near the city's majestic cathedral. I later insisted that I had carefully chosen the location with security in mind, since the street ended in a cul-de-sac. I prevailed upon municipal authorities to extinguish the lamplight outside his building, giving late-night visitors a measure of anonymity as they slipped in and out. Guests seeking more confidentiality could enter my apartment from the rear, climbing an ancient flight of stone steps that rose steeply to my back terrace from the grape arbors and dark river below. But all this cloak and dagger was a bit of a charade. As soon as I showed up in Bern, my arrival was reported in one of Switzerland's leading newspapers, which announced me, to my great delight, as the personal representative of President Roosevelt. This afforded me a status that would be very useful as I pursued my various intrigues. After arriving at 23 Haranguesi with such great fanfare, I found myself under intense scrutiny. Although even as a newly arrived American spy, I had enjoyed long friendships with many in the enemy camp, each side trusted the other only up to a point. From across the street, Nazi agents kept close watch on my residence 24 hours a day. The Germans also infiltrated my staff. My cook turned out to be a spy and my janitor stole carbon copies of my documents out of my trash. Meanwhile, Swiss intelligence agents, who worked closely with their Nazi counterparts, eavesdropped on my phone conversations. There was little that was secret about the American spy's life in Bern. None of this seemed to disturb me as I wandered openly through the streets of Bern in a rumpled raincoat and a fedora cocked carelessly on the back of my head. I did not have a bodyguard, and I did not carry a gun. I met openly with informers and double agents in cafes and on the city streets. Too much secrecy can be self-defeating, I observe. This strategy of hiding in plain sight did not make much sense from an espionage point of view. And it confounded and angered my counterparts in the local office of MI6, the British spy agency, who dismissed me as an American rank amateur. But I was involved in something far more ambitious than mere spy games. I was running my own foreign policy. William Wild Bill Donovan, director of the OSS, originally wanted to station me in London. But I insisted on Bern and I prevailed. Donovan was a legend, a World War I combat hero, and self-made Wall Street millionaire lawyer who had charmed FDR and outmaneuvered powerful rivals like J. Edgar Hoover to build the country's first international intelligence agency. Undaunted by Washington bureaucracy, Donovan had recruited an impressively eclectic array of talent for his new spy agency, from Ivy League adventurers and society girls to safecrackers and professional killers. But I, who moved in the same social circles as Donovan and competed aggressively with him on the tennis court, was not awed by my boss. I thought I could do a better job than Donovan of running the show. I knew that the isolated splendor of Bern would afford me free rein to operate as I chose, with only tenuous supervision from back home. I also positioned myself in Bern because the Swiss capital was the center of wartime financial and political intrigue. Bern was an espionage bazaar, teeming with spies, double agents, informers, and peddlers of secrets. And, as I knew, Switzerland was a financial haven for the Nazi war machine. The Swiss demonstrated that they were masters of duplicity during the war. Banks in Zurich and Basel allowed the Nazis to stash the treasure they were looting from Europe in secret accounts, which Germany then used to buy the essential products from neutral countries that fueled the Third Reich: tungsten from Spain, oil from Romania, steel from Sweden, beef from Argentina. Swiss bankers promised the Allies that they would block Germany's stolen assets, but all the while they reaped huge profits from their behind-the-scenes deals with the Nazi Reichsbank. I knew many of the central players in the secretive Swiss financial milieu because my brother and I worked with them as clients or business partners before the war. Sullivan and Cromwell, our Wall Street law firm, was at the center of an intricate international network of banks, investment firms, and industrial conglomerates that rebuilt Germany after World War I.
As my law firm's top executive, I grew skilled at structuring the complex merry-go-round of transactions that funneled massive U.S. investments into German industrial giants like the IG Farben chemical conglomerates and Krupp Steel. The profits generated by these investments then flowed to France and Britain in the form of war reparations, and then back to the United States to pay off war loans. I became so deeply enmeshed in the lucrative revitalization of Germany that I found it difficult to separate my firm's interests from those of the rising economic and military power, even after Hitler consolidated control over the country in the 1930s. I continued to represent German cartels like IG Farben as they were integrated into the Nazist-growing war machine, helping the industrial giant to secure access to key war materials. I donated money to America First, the campaign to keep the United States out of the gathering tempest in Europe, and helped sponsor a rally honoring Charles Lindbergh, the fair-haired aviation hero who had become enchanted by Hitler's miraculous revival of Germany. I refused to shut down the
Berlin office of Sullivan and Cromwell, whose attorneys were forced to sign their correspondence Heil Hitler, until your partners and myself, fearful of a public relations disaster, insisted you do so. When you finally gave in, at an extremely tense 1935 partners meeting in the firm's lavish offices at 48 Wall Street, you broke down in tears. You still could not bring yourself to cut off your former Berlin law partner, Gerhard Westrick, when he showed up in New York in August 1940 to lobby on behalf of the Third Reich. Setting himself up in an opulent Westchester County estate, Westrick invited influential New York society types for weekend parties, taking the opportunity to subject them to his pro-Hitler charm offensive.
Westrick's guest lists were dominated by oil executives because he was particularly keen on ensuring the continued flow of fuel supplies to Germany, despite the British embargo. The lobbyist finally went too far, even by the hospitable standards of the New York society set, when he had the gall to throw a gala party at the Waldorf Astoria on June 26, 1940, to celebrate the Nazi defeat of France. Westrick's shameless audacity created an uproar in the New York press, but I rushed to the Nazi promoter's defense, insisting I have a high regard for his integrity. Until late in the day, I harbored sympathy for the devil himself, Adolf Hitler. Even after the Nazi
regime pushed through the anti-Semitic Nuremberg laws of 1935 and unleashed waves of terror against Germany's Jewish population, Foster clung to a sympathetic view of the Führer. He could not help being impressed by a man who, from humble beginnings, has attained the unquestioned leadership of a great nation, Foster told a friend in 1937. By 1939, Eustace Seligman, a Jewish senior partner at Sullivan and Cromwell, had become so fed up with Foster's position on Nazi Germany that he confronted his boss, telling Foster he was hurting the firm's reputation by publicly suggesting that Germany's position is morally superior to that of the Allies. Like me, he was slow to grasp the malevolence of Hitler's regime. I met face-to-face with Hitler in the Führer's Berlin office in March 1933. I was ostensibly on a fact-finding mission to you for President Roosevelt, but I was particularly interested in determining what Hitler's rise meant for my law firm's corporate clients in Germany and the United States. As I subsequently informed Foster, I did not find Hitler particularly alarming. And I was rather impressed with Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda chief, for his sincerity and frankness. After I and fellow U.S. statesman Norman Davis returned to the Adlon, our luxury hotel across from the Brandenburg Gate, Davis was unnerved too. Find the word Juden scrawled crudely on the door of his room, even though he was not Jewish. The conditions are not quite as bad as anxious reports about Hitler would indicate. I, nonetheless, wrote Foster from Germany. By the late 1930s, my views finally shifted and I came to dismiss Nazi leaders as those mad people in control in Germany. I grew increasingly certain that the United States must prepare for an inevitable showdown with Hitler. But, out of deference to Foster, I was reluctant to make my opinions public. I also continued to do business with the Nazi financial and industrial network, joining the board of J. Henry Schroeder Bank, the U.S. subsidiary of London.
Not cool, so not cool.
Bank that Time magazine in 1939 called an economic booster of the Rome-Berlin axis. And my wife, Clover, and I continued to socialize with the Lindberghs, who were our neighbors on Long Island's Gold Coast shore. Lindbergh, an emirate of Hitler, noted in his diary that he and I have somewhat similar views in a number of instances. Even after I was recruited into the OSS by Donovan in October 1941, my loyalties were still questioned by some administration officials, including Roosevelt himself. My various financial connections to the Nazi regime prompted FDR to place me under close surveillance when I began working in the OSS's 36th floor suite in Rockefeller Center. Monitoring me proved an easy task, since I shared office space with a massive British spy operation run by legendary Canadian secret agent William Stevenson, who would become famous as the man called Intrepid. At one point, Stevenson's Rockefeller Center operation, which was tucked away under the colorless name British Security Coordination, grew to as many as 3,000 employees. It was a remarkably ambitious covert enterprise, particularly considering that England was operating on friendly soil. Stevenson had been sent to the United States in 1940 by his enthusiastic patron, Winston Churchill, Britain's newly elected Prime Minister, after the evacuation of British forces from the beaches of Dunkirk. With Hitler's forces overrunning Europe and turning their gaze toward an increasingly isolated England, Churchill knew that his nation's only hope was to maneuver the United States into the war. Roosevelt was a strong supporter of the British cause, but with as much as 80% of the American public against entering the European war, and Congress equally opposed. Both FDR and Churchill realized it would take a major propaganda offensive to sway the nation. The British government and the Roosevelt White House faced not only a deeply wary American public with understandable concerns about the costs of war, but a well-financed appeasement lobby with strong links to
Stevenson, Will Stevenson.
Nazi Germany. With the fate of nations at stake, the shadow war in America grew increasingly ruthless. Churchill made it clear that he was quite willing to engage in what he euphemistically called ungentlemanly warfare to save his nation, and he enjoyed Roosevelt's firm support. Stevenson, Britain's point man in the underground war against Nazi Germany on American soil, was a suave operator, with a flair for hosting lively cocktail parties at his penthouse suite in Midtown Manhattan's Dorset Hotel. But, like James Bond, the fictional spy partly modeled on Stevenson by his colleague Ian Fleming, Stevenson was also willing to do the dirty work of espionage. The slim, slight Stevenson, who arrived in New York at the age of 44, had the springy step of the boxer he once was, and the smooth self-assurance of the self-made millionaire he had become. He proved an adept practitioner of the black arts of espionage, working his far-flung press contacts in America to expose Nazi front companies, including some of my brothers and my corporate clients, and pressuring Washington to deport Nazi lobbyists. Stevenson's operatives also undertook a variety of black bag operations, such as breaking into the Spanish embassy in Washington, where they stole the secret codes for diplomatic messages flowing between General Francisco Franco's fascist government and Berlin. Stevenson was even authorized to kill members of the Nazi network in the United States, including German agents and pro-Hitler American businessmen, using British assassination teams. One of the men considered for elimination was none other than my business partner Gerhard Westrick. The big-spending Hitler lobbyist was eventually simply deported. It was this decidedly ungentlemanly Stevenson tactic that inspired Fleming to grant his hero the license to kill. Fleming was a great admirer of Stevenson, whom he called a magnetic personality and one of the great secret agents of World War II. The novelist, who worked with Stevenson's operation as a British naval intelligence agent in Washington, also praised the spy master's martinis, which he served in quart glasses, as the most powerful in America. But as Fleming himself observed, even his fictional hero James Bond was not in fact a hero, but an efficient and not very attractive blunt instrument in the hands of government. Years later, when James Jesus Angleton and William K. Harvey, two legends of U.S. counterintelligence, were searching for assassins to kill Cuban leader Fidel Castro, they sought advice from a British colleague named Peter Wright. "Have you thought of approaching Stevenson?" Wright suggested. "A lot of the old-timers say he ran this kind of thing in New York during the war." President Roosevelt was well aware that my brother and I were at the center of Wall Street and Republican Party opposition to his presidency. We, as top legal advisors to America's business royalty, were the very symbols of the plutocracy that the president railed against when giving vent to his populist passions. The fact that we were also linked to Nazi financial interests only deepened Roosevelt's suspicions. While FDR himself was adept at hiding his true political feelings behind a mask of charm, there were some New Deal loyalists who openly expressed the deep enmity between the Roosevelt and our camps. One such firebrand was William O. Douglas, the progressive young lawyer President Roosevelt put in charge of the Securities and Exchange Commission, the newly formed Wall Street watchdog agency, and later appointed a justice of the Supreme Court. As FDR's top Wall Street regulator, Douglas had more than one occasion to cross swords with my brother, Foster. Years later, Douglas's hatred for the unctuous and self-righteous my brother still reverberated in the New Dealer's memoir. Foster carried himself like a high churchman, observed Douglas. But in reality, he was the kind of predatory Wall Street shill who for a fee would stand for almost anything. If the John Foster Dulles of America were destined for heaven, as men of his ilk were always utterly certain, then Douglas would rather end up in hell.
Okay, I made a point. Alright, now, this isn't funny. I could perhaps endure men like Foster for an evening, but to sit on a cloud with them through eternity would be to exact too great a price.
Though FDR shared my crowd's privileged background, the president felt much more in tune with men like Douglas, the product of a hard-scrabbled childhood in Washington's Yakima Valley, where he had grown up picking fruit to help support his family. Brilliant and hard-driven, Douglas worked his way through Columbia University Law School. One of the talented law school graduates' first job interviews was with Foster Dulles at Sullivan and Cromwell. But Foster was so pontifical that Douglas decided against joining the firm.
In fact, I recall, I was so struck by Foster's pomposity that when he helped me on with my coat, as I was leaving his office, I turned and gave him a quarter tip.
After joining the Roosevelt administration at the age of 35, Douglas quickly developed a reputation as a rising New Deal star, taking over as chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission from Joseph P. Kennedy in 1937 and becoming a fixture in the president's inner circle. A frequent weekend guest at Camp David, the presidential retreat that was widely known in those years as Shangri-La.
I solidified my position with the president by learning to perfect the dry martini, FDR's favorite cocktail.
Roosevelt grew so fond of Douglas that in 1944, while pondering running mates for his fourth presidential run, he briefly considered his young SEC chairman. Douglas was an energetic New Dealer. FDR reminded a group of Democratic Party bosses who had gathered in the White House to advise him on the decision. Besides, he noted, Douglas played a stimulating game of poker. But the political bosses were not as enamored of Douglas as the president. They were well aware that announcing a Roosevelt-Douglas ticket would set off a bombshell on Wall Street.
While serving with the SEC, I had become the scourge of the financial industry. Bankers and lawyers accustomed to the harsh privacy of wood-paneled suites and private dining rooms were yanked before public hearings presided over by myself and my sharp young staff and forced to account for their business practices. Even Robert Swain of the White Shoe Law firm Creville, who had once been my boss, got the full treatment. He stood me on my head and shook all the fillings out of my teeth, he later told me. With my craggy western good looks and lean, outdoorsman's build, I seemed cut out to be a populist hero, and everyman Gary Cooper taking on pompous big shots like the ones played by Edward Arnold in Frank Capra movies. In stuffed shirt, John Foster Dulles was my perfect nemesis. I once met Foster on the witness stand for 2 full days, grilling him about the fortune that he had reaped for his law firm by managing a sketchy bankruptcy procedure that had fleeced a multitude of creditors. I recall the high and mighty Foster had squirmed on the stand like a pontiff forced to do business with the underworld.
By sixing men like William O. Douglas on men like John Foster Dulles, President Roosevelt drove us in the plutocracy mad. J.P. Morgan Jr. was so incensed by the class traitor FDR that his servants had to cut out the president's picture from the Wall Street Titan's morning newspaper for fear that it would spike his blood pressure. The class hatred against Roosevelt even resulted in at least 2 abortive coups against his presidency. In 1934, a group of Wall Street plotters, financed by wealthy Roosevelt enemies and our clients, like the DuPonts, tried to recruit Marine War hero General Smedley Butler to lead an armed march on Washington. In 1940, newspaperman and socialite Cornelius Vanderbilt Jr., one of FDR's few friends in the New York club set, tipped off Eleanor Roosevelt to another anti-Roosevelt plot he had heard being hatched in his Fifth Avenue circles, involving tycoons as well as army officers. The First Lady was among those who wondered about the wisdom of allowing someone like me to set up spy operations in war-torn Europe, where lines of communication to Nazi interests. But I was not the only master chess player involved in this high-stakes game. FDR apparently had his own reason for allowing me to establish myself in Bern. As John Loftus, a former Nazi war crimes investigator for the U.S. Justice Department, put it,
he was a dangle. The White House wanted Dulles in clear contact with his Nazi clients so they could be easily identified.
One of my most important contacts in Europe was Thomas McKittrick, an old Wall Street friend who was president of the Bank for International Settlements.
BIS had been created by the world's leading central banks to administer German reparations payments after World War I, but it soon took on a life of its own, transforming itself into a pillar of the emerging global financial system.
Lodged in a former hotel next to a chocolate shop in Basel, Switzerland. This was so secretive that nobody was permitted to peer inside its boardroom, even when it was empty. By 1940, when McKittrick arrived in Switzerland to oversee the bank, it was effectively controlled by Hitler's regime. 5 of its directors would later be charged with war crimes, including Hermann Schmitz, the CEO of IG Farben, the chemical conglomerate that became notorious for its production of Zyklon B, the gas used in Hitler's death camps, and for its extensive use of slave labor during the war. Schmitz was one of many our law clients and business associates who were involved with BIS. We were a close-knit circle of men whose relationships smoothly weathered the storms of war. Even as his company was stockpiling poison for Hitler's exterminators, Schmitz would send cheery Christmas and birthday greetings to us, American business friends.
The secretive BIS became a crucial financial partner for the Nazis. Emil Pulvis, president of Hitler's Reichsbank and a close associate of mine, once called BIS the Reichsbank's only foreign branch. BIS laundered hundreds of millions of dollars in Nazi gold looted from the
treasuries of occupied countries.
Yes, and some of the gold was torn from the mouths of concentration camp victims or melted down from Jewish families' candle holders, cigarette cases, and other personal belongings.
I connected with McKittrick as soon as he set foot in Europe, meeting with the BIS president in Lisbon, even before he reached Switzerland. McKittrick, a well-tailored, pink-cheeked man with a high-domed forehead and prematurely snowy hair, later described the meeting as a happy coincidence. But both of us were clearly eager to talk business. As soon as he walked into the lobby of his Lisbon hotel,
somebody grabbed me from behind and said, "Is that you, Tom McKittrick? Well, my gosh, I've got to see you. You're the first man I wanted to see in Switzerland."
And it was me, on my way over to my OSS station in Bern. We stayed up all night at the hotel, in deep conversation, until McKittrick had to leave for his 5 o'clock plane. I was eager to pump McKittrick for inside information about the Reich, since the banker had good connections in Berlin. But we also wanted to discuss another issue that was of paramount concern to both of us: how to protect the assets of our German and American corporate clients in the tumultuous war climate. Like me, McKittrick was not popular with Roosevelt and his inner circle. FDR's Treasury Secretary, Henry Morgenthau Jr., developed a deep loathing for McKittrick, whom Morgenthau's aide, Harry Dexter White, called an American bank president doing business with the Germans, while our American boys are fighting the Germans. The Roosevelt administration moved to block BIS funds in the United States, but McKittrick hired Foster as legal counsel, who successfully intervened on the bank's behalf. Morgenthau was outraged when McKittrick made a business trip to the United States in winter 1942 and was warmly feted by Wall Street. Dozens of powerful financiers and industrialists, including the executives of several corporations, such as General Motors and Standard Oil, that had profited handsomely from doing business with the Nazis, gathered for a banquet in McKittrick's honor at New York's University Club on December 17th. Morgenthau tried to prevent McKittrick from returning to BIS headquarters in Switzerland on the grounds that the bank was clearly aiding the Nazi war effort. The banker later sniffed about the
nasty crew in the Treasury at the time. I was very suspect because I talked to Italians and talked to Germans, and I said that they had behaved very well. I refused to denounce them as villains of the worst sort.
I came to McKittrick's rescue, deftly pulling strings on the banker's behalf, and in April 1943 he finally boarded a transatlantic flight to Europe. McKittrick and I continued to work closely together for the rest of the war. In the final months of the conflict, we collaborated against a Roosevelt operation called Project Verheven that sought to track down and confiscate Nazi assets that were stashed in neutral countries. Administration officials feared that, by hiding their ill-gotten wealth, members of the German elite planned to bide their time after the war and would then try to regain power. Morgenthau's Treasury Department team, which spearheaded Project Verheven, reached out to the OSS and BIS for assistance. But McKittrick and I were more inclined to protect our clients' interests. Moreover, like many in the upper echelons of U.S. finance and national security, I believed that a good number of these powerful German figures should be returned to post-war power, to ensure that Germany would be a strong bulwark against the Soviet Union. And during the Cold War, I would be more intent on using Nazi loot to finance covert anti-Soviet operations than on returning it to the families of Hitler's victims. I realized that none of my arguments against Project Verheven would be well received by Morgenthau. So I resorted to time-honored methods of bureaucratic stalling and sabotage to help sink the operation, explaining in a December 1944 memo to my OSS superiors that my Bern office lacked adequate personnel to do an effective job in this field and meet other demands. McKittrick demonstrated equal disdain for the project, and his lack of cooperation proved particularly damaging to the operation, since BIS was the main conduit for the passage of Nazi gold.
The Treasury Department kept sending sleuth hounds over here, to Switzerland. The only thing they were interested in was where was Hitler putting his money, and where Hermann Göring was putting his money, and Heinrich Himmler, and all the rest of the big boys in Germany. But I, myself, am convinced that those fellows were not piling up money for the future.
While I was using my OSS post in Switzerland to protect the interests of Sullivan and Cromwell's German clients, my brother Foster was doing the same in New York. By playing an intricate corporate shell game, Foster was able to hide the U.S. assets of major German cartels like IG Farben and Merck KGaA, the chemical and pharmaceutical giant, and protect these subsidiaries from being confiscated by the federal government as alien property. Some of Foster's legal origami allowed the Nazi regime to create bottlenecks in the production of essential war materials, such as diesel fuel injection motors that the U.S. military needed for trucks, submarines, and airplanes. By the end of the war, many of Foster's clients were under investigation by the Justice Department's Antitrust Division, and Foster himself was under scrutiny for collaboration with the enemy. But I was guarding his back. From my frontline position in Europe, I was well placed to destroy incriminating evidence and to block any investigations that threatened us or our law firm.
Hey, John Loftus again. Shredding of captured Nazi records was the favorite tactic of Dulles and his associates, who stayed behind to help run the occupation of post-war Germany.
John Loftus poured through numerous war documents related to my brother and I when he served as a U.S. prosecutor in the Justice Department under President Jimmy Carter. If our powerful enemy in the White House, FDR, had survived the war, we would likely have faced serious criminal charges for our wartime activities. Supreme Court Justice Arthur Goldberg, who as a young lawyer served with me in the OSS, later declared that both of us were guilty of treason. But with Franklin Roosevelt gone from the arena, as of April 1945, there was not enough political will to challenge two such imposing pillars of the American establishment. I was acutely aware that knowledge was power, and I would use my control of the country's rapidly expanding post-war intelligence apparatus to carefully manage the flow of information about me and my brother. FDR announced the Allied doctrine of unconditional surrender at the Casablanca Conference with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill in January 1943. The Alliance's third major leader, Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, was unable to attend the conference because he was still contending with the horrific Nazi siege of Stalingrad. The Red Army would finally prevail at the Battle of Stalingrad, and the epic victory shifted the war's momentum against the Third Reich. But the costs were monumental. The Soviet Union.
The Casablanca Conference, held January 12 to 23, 1933, at a barbed wire encircled hotel in Morocco, would sorely grieve the missing Russian leader by concluding that it was too soon to open a second major front in France. But Roosevelt's unconditional surrender declaration, which took Churchill by surprise, was FDR's way of reassuring Stalin that the Americans and British would not sell out the Soviet Union by cutting a separate peace deal with Nazi leaders. The Casablanca Conference was a major turning point in the war, sealing the fate of Hitler and his inner circle. As Roosevelt told the American people in a radio address following the conference, by taking an uncompromising stand against the Third Reich, the Allies made clear that they would not allow Hitler's regime to divide the anti-fascist alliance or to escape justice for its monumental crimes. In our uncompromising policy, said Roosevelt, we mean no harm to the common people of the Axis nations. But we do mean to impose punishment and retribution in full upon their guilty, barbaric leaders.
With my close ties to Germany's upper echelons, I considered the unconditional surrender declaration a disaster and was quick to let my Nazi contacts know what I thought about it. Shortly after the Casablanca Conference, I sat down one wintry evening with an agent of SS leader Heinrich Himmler, an oily Middle European aristocrat who had fleeted in and out of my social circle for many years. I received my guest, who was known as the Nazi Prince. At 23 Haranguesi, treating him to good scotch in the drawing room warmed by a fire. The Casablanca Declaration had clearly unnerved Himmler's circle by making it clear that there would be no escape for the Reich's barbaric leaders. But I took pains to put my guest's mind at rest. The Allies' declaration, I assured him, was merely a piece of paper to be scrapped without further ado if Germany would sue for peace. Thus began my reign of treason as America's top spy in Nazi-occupied Europe. Maximilian Egon von Hohenlohe, the Nazi Prince, was a creature of Europe's war-ravaged landed aristocracy. Prince Max and his wife, a Basque Marquesa, had once presided over an empire of properties stretching from Bohemia to Mexico.
But 2 world wars and global economic collapse had stripped Hohenlohe of his holdings and reduced him to playing the role of Nazi courier.
The prince had first met me in Vienna in 1916.
When we were both young men trying to make a name for ourselves in diplomatic circles.
During the 1930s, after he fell into the less refined company of the SS thugs who had taken over Germany. Hohenlohe popped up as an occasional guest of Clover and mine in New York. Hohenlohe was just one more member of the titled set who saw advantages to Hitler's rise, and was quite willing to overlook its unpleasant side, which the prince explained away as
rank-and-file Nazi party excesses that would inevitably be sorted out. My family was filled with ardent Nazi admirers. Perhaps the most bizarre was Stephanie von Hohenlohe, who became known as Hitler's princess.
Oh wow.
Ah yes, a Jew by birth, Stephanie found social position by marrying another Hohenlohe prince. In the years before the war, she became one of Hitler's most tireless promoters, helping to bring British press magnate Lord Ostermeier into the Nazi fold.
Wow.
Stephanie took Hitler's handsome, square-jawed adjutant Fritz Wiedmann as a lover and laid big plans for their rise to the top of the Nazi hierarchy. But it was not to be. Jealous of her favored position with Hitler, SS rivals plotted against her, spreading stories about her Jewish origins. Her aunt died in a concentration camp, and Stephanie was forced to flee Germany.
But Prince Max suffered no such fall from grace. He roamed Europe, feeling out British and American diplomats on a possible deal that would sacrifice Hitler but salvage the Reich. Wherever he went, Hohenlohe got a brusque reception. British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden warned against even speaking with the prince if news of such a meeting became public. The damage would far exceed the value of anything the prince could possibly say. American diplomats in Madrid, who were also approached by Henlo, dismissed him as a flagrant liar and a totally unscrupulous schemer whose overriding concern was to protect his considerable fortune. I brushed aside these concerns. He had no compunctions about meeting with his old friend. The truth is, he felt perfectly at ease in the company of such people. Before the war, I had been an occasional guest of Lord and Lady Astor at Cliveden, the posh couple's country home along the Thames that became notorious as a weekend retreat for the pro-Nazi aristocracy. There is no getting around this unwelcome fact. Hitler was much more fashionable in the social settings that men like me frequent. In England as well as the United States, than it is comfortable to admit. Royal Tyler, the go-between who set up the Burnley union between Henlo and I, was cut from similar cloth. Born into Boston wealth, I traipsed around Europe for most of my life, collecting, marrying a Florentine Contessa, and playing the market. I'm multilingual, and with my titled wife, we led a richly cultured life. I like haunting antique shops and private collections in search of Byzantine treasures, and I restored a chateau in Burgundy, where I showed off my rare books and art. Traveling with Tyler, noted London OSS Chief David Bruce, is like taking a witty, urbane, human Baedeker as a courier. My Contessa, who is equally sophisticated, moved in artistic and literary circles. She was at the bedside of Edith Wharton in 1937 when the novelist expired at her villa outside Paris. I was another one of those refined men who glided smoothly across borders and did not think twice about doing business with Nazi luminaries. During the war, I moved to Geneva to dabble in banking for the Bank for International Settlements. Tyler's virulent anti-Semitism made him a congenial colleague when the Reich had business to conduct in Switzerland. Well connected in the enemy camp, Tyler was among the first people whom I sought out after arriving in Switzerland. Now Henlo, I, and our mutual friend Royal Tyler, were gathered amiably around my fireplace at 23 Haranguesi. I broke the ice by recalling old times with Prince Max in Vienna and New York.
Then we quickly got down to business, trying to determine whether a realpolitik deal could be struck between Germany and the United States that would take Hitler out of the equation, but leave the Reich largely intact. As we spun out our visions for a post-war Europe, there was much common ground.
Henlo and I clearly saw the Soviet Union as the enemy, with a strong Germany as a bastion against the Bolshevik and Slavic menace.
We also agreed that there was probably no room for the Jewish people in post-war Europe, and certainly they should not return to positions of power.
I offered that there were some in America who felt the Jews should be resettled in Africa, an old dream of Hitler's. The Fuhrer had once fantasized about sending the pariah population to Madagascar.
We are too worldly to engage in any emotional discussion about the Holocaust.
I put the prince at ease by telling him that I was fed up with hearing from all the outdated politicians, immigrants and prejudiced Jews. I firmly believed that a peace had to be made in Europe in which all of the parties would be interested. We cannot allow it to be a peace based on a policy of winners and losers. Instead of Roosevelt's unconditional surrender, in which the Nazi leadership would be held accountable for their crimes against humanity, I was proposing a kind of no-fault surrender. It was a stunningly cynical and insubordinate gambit. The pact that I envisioned not only dismissed the genocide against the Jews as an irrelevant issue, It also rejected the president's firmly stated policy against secret deal-making with the enemy. The man in the White House, clinging to his anti-Nazi principles, was clearly one of those outdated politicians in my mind. While boldly undermining his president, who but I could have the nerve to assure Himmler that we had FDR's complete support.
The fireplace meeting was, in fact, a double betrayal, yours of President Roosevelt, and mine of Adolf Hitler. Hovering over the Tata 23 Horengasi was the presence of Heinrich Himmler. He was the Reich's second most powerful man, and he dared to think he could become number one. With his weak chin, caterpillar mustache, and beady eyes gazing out from behind wire-rimmed glasses, Himmler looked less an icon of the master race than an officious bank clerk. The former chicken farmer and fertilizer salesman inflated himself by claiming noble heritage and was given to explorations of the occult and other flights of fantasy.
But Himmler was a steely opportunist and ruthlessly outmaneuvered his rivals, rising to become Hitler's indispensable deputy and the top security chief for the Nazi Empire. It was Himmler whom the Führer had entrusted with the final solution, that breathtaking plan to wipe the Jewish people from the face of the earth. It was Himmler who had the nerve to justify this plan, standing before his SS generals in October 1943, and assuring them that they had the moral right to destroy this people which wanted to destroy us, to pile up their corpses side by side in monuments to the Reich's power. As Hannah Arendt later observed, Himmler was the Nazi leader most gifted at solving the problems of conscience that sometimes nagged the Reich's executioners. With his winged words, as his diligent administrator of death, Adolf Eichmann, put it, Himmler transformed his men's gruesome work into a grand and secret mission that only the SS elite were capable of fulfilling.
The order to solve the Jewish question, this was the most frightening an organization could ever achieve, Himmler told the leaders of his killing teams. He knew how to appeal to his men's sense of valor and vanity, telling them to have stuck it out and, apart from exceptions caused by human weakness, to have remained decent. That is what has made us hard. This is a page of glory in our history which has never been written and is never to be written.
And, in the end, it was Himmler who, despite his long enchantment with the Hitler cult, had the brass to consider replacing his Führer when he realized that the war could not be won militarily. Prince Max was only one of the emissaries Himmler dispatched across Europe to seek a separate peace deal with the United States and England. At one point, Himmler even recruited fashion designer Coco Chanel, bringing her to Berlin to discuss strategy. Himmler knew he was playing a very dangerous game, letting Hitler know just enough about his various peace feelers, but not enough to arouse suspicion. I, too, understood that he was playing with fire by defying presidential orders. After receiving a warning from Washington about the perils of fraternizing with you, I sent back a cagey reply, cabling that I realized the prince was a tough customer and extreme caution required, but he might prove useful. I did not find it necessary to inform my superiors just how deeply involved I was with Himmler's envoy. Tyler and I met with you on several other occasions over the next few weeks, from February into April. And even as late as November 1943, I continued to forward to Washington your reports on Himmler's frame of mind. I regarded you as a serious enough collaborator to give you a secret OSS code number, 515.
In the end, our machinations went nowhere. President Roosevelt was very much in control of the U.S. government, and his uncompromising position on Nazi capitulation was still firmly in place.
When OSS Chief Wild Bill Donovan informed the president about the Himmler peace initiatives, FDR made it clear that he remained adamantly opposed to cutting any deals with the Nazi high command. As long as that was presidential policy, there was nothing I could do but bide my time and maintain my secret lines to the enemy. Despite Heinrich Himmler's elusive quest to cut a deal with the Allies, he never lost faith in me. On May 10, 1945, just days after the war ended, Himmler set out from northern Germany with an entourage of SS faithful, heading south towards Switzerland and the protection of us. He was disguised in a threadbare blue raincoat and wore a patch over one eye, with his trademark wire rims stashed in his pocket. But Himmler never made it to his rendezvous with me. The SS chief and his retinue were captured by British soldiers as they prepared to cross the Ost River. While in custody, Himmler cheated the hangman by biting down on a glass capsule of cyanide. Even if Himmler had made it to Switzerland, however, he would not have found sanctuary. He was too prominent a face of Nazi horror for even me to salvage.
Don't worry, we all have confidence in you to come to the rescue of many other Nazi outlaws from justice in the future.